Hey, what's up? It's Jesko again from AcousticsInsider.com, where I teach home studio acoustic treatment techniques for audio professionals, but without all the voodoo. I'm back with another YouTube questions knowledge bomb. This is the segment where I answer your questions from the YouTube comments, because I don't get in there regularly enough and I feel guilty for leaving you guys stranded. So in this video, I'm going to dive into some of the questions that I see under my videos and just do a kind of a rapid fire Q&A session to see what we get. But before I do that, I want to help you out. If you're in the process of treating your home studio, it's so easy to get lost in that process. And that's why I created the Home Studio Treatment Framework that you can download for free at the link in the description. These are my 5 steps to systematically treating a home studio and getting it to translate. It's the same process that I teach my students. It's the same process that I use when I treat a home studio. And it's all in there, all the different steps in the right order, telling you what to focus on and what to ignore in order for you to actually make this whole process a success and not get lost in the rabbit hole of all the details. So it's all in there. Setting up your speakers, finding your listening position, choosing the right treatment, placing your treatment, when to include subwoofers, how to use measurements, how to use speaker calibration. It's all in there, nicely laid out for you in a step-by-step process. It's basically kind of a top-level perspective for you to follow and really get you to that place where you can finally trust your speakers and stop thinking about sound. So once again, download my home studio treatment framework at the link in the description and make sure you're not getting lost in the details of this journey of acoustic treatment. So with that, let's get to these questions. And this first one is from Renek6434, and he asks a question on a video called "Why Treat Modal Resonances Below the Speaker Cutoff, example 40 Hertz. And he says, related question, does it make sense to cut off my speaker at 40 Hertz if I have a massive mode below that, which will be difficult to treat? My initial instinct is no. Definitely don't cut it off entirely. You still want that energy. You still want to be able to work with that energy if your speaker system actually plays energy below 40 Hertz. And the reason is that in the long term, in my opinion, you need to learn how to deal with those low frequencies, no matter what room you're in, what speakers you have, what music you're working with. In the long run, you have to learn how to deal with those low frequencies and not leave it up to chance, basically, right? Because if you cut off your speakers or your speaker system at 40 Hertz, you won't know what's going on below 40 Hertz. And even if it's not perfectly controlled, even if it's not really exactly where, from an artistic perspective, you really want that sub bass to sit, it's still better to have some idea of what's going on rather than having no idea. Yeah, I mean, in many cases, you'll probably be fine and the mastering engineer will kind of be able to kind of take care of it. But you're the mixing engineer. You're the person who needs to tell and say what happens to those low frequencies in the end. Yeah, so this is your job and I don't think you should leave it up to anybody else. Good question though. Moving on. This next one is by Roger Wessel on a video, well, the same video, Why Treat Modal Resonances Below the Speaker Cutoff. And he says, thank you for the excellent content, as always. I appreciate it. Thank you. I have followed your advice and have finally got a pretty good environment for mixing music, except that I still have a huge resonant peak at 27 Hertz, maybe about 10 to 12 decibels. I wonder if the right way to address this would be to help build a Helmholtz resonator. What is your thought on that? Well, kind of similar to what was to the previous question. My thoughts are that you need to be able to work with those low frequencies to some extent. And there are different ways to approach this. 27 Hertz, though, is very, very low. Most instruments basically don't reach that low. And even bass instruments often don't reach that low. So we're talking about very, very deep sub bass that only very, very occasionally kind of pops up in the music. Yeah, so there's a question of just relative importance here, yeah, how much effort you want to put into actually controlling and really dialing such low frequencies, especially in a home studio. Yeah, I know this might sound counter to what I just said, But yeah, you want to learn how to work with those frequencies, but you also have to ask yourself how much effort, money, time are you willing to put into actually getting that perfect? Yeah, oftentimes it's a good enough is good enough. And in that sense, especially if you're dealing with a huge peak, you probably will be able to reduce that by just using EQ. Yeah, so some sort of either speaker calibration system or using an EQ in your interface, that might be possible, or even just having a template for your workstation, for your DAW, that reduces that energy to a manageable amount. Yeah, that is probably the easiest way to deal with this. The thing with Helmholtz resonators is that, sure, technically this is the right solution if you really want to control it properly, but building those and getting them to work is extremely difficult. Yeah, from many different perspectives. First of all, just building the thing and getting it to actually work is difficult enough. You have to choose the right materials. You have to design it the right way. You have to build it the right way. The way you basically apply the holes, the number of holes, the size of the holes, whether you're going to place insulation material, damping inside the box. All these things play into tuning the resonance system, and that in itself is difficult enough. On top of that, you need to place it in the right spot in your room, which is also more difficult than you might think. These devices are very sensitive to placement, especially at these very low frequencies. And you might find that in your typical home studio, you can't place it properly. You can get it to kind of sort of work if you're lucky, but there are many instances where you just might not be able to place it where you need to put it, just because you're dealing with a room with limited space. And there's a lot of other stuff in the room. You need to have all the other types of treatment in the room. So Helmholtz resonators are technically the right solution, but in practice, very difficult to implement. And in proper studio designs, these very, very low frequency absorption devices, whether they are pressure devices or otherwise, they are designed into the entire treatment plan from the very beginning. So it's very hard to do this. I got a video out on why it's so difficult to treat low end after the fact on my channel as well. I'll link it in the card right now. So those are my thoughts. Yeah, easiest will be to just use EQ, yeah, and just get it to a place where it's good enough. That's my recommendation in a home studio for 27 hertz, 30 hertz, that sort of issues. Yeah. Good question. This next one is from Tom Cheon. Oh my God. Tomki Own, I don't know, 6970 on a video called Avoid Studio Desk Reflections. Is it time for an upgrade? And he asks, what frequencies do you normally see affected by the desk reflection? So it varies depending on the exact position of the speakers relative to the desk and your listening position. But usually the kind of strongest, or most obvious and widest dips and peaks caused by the desk reflection are somewhere in the range kind of upwards of 200, 300 hertz, up to maybe 700 hertz. That's where kind of you get very wide dips and peaks, usually one or two. And then because we're talking about a comb filter getting created, the higher you go up in frequency, at least if you're looking at it on a logarithmic scale, these peaks and dips will get closer and closer together. But ultimately, you will see the effect, the comb filter that gets created from the desk reflection. You will see that upwards of around 200, 300 hertz, all the way right up to the top end. Yeah. So those typical desk reflection filters tend to address those very wide, 2-3 wide peaks and dips in the kind of 300 to 700 hertz range, because that's where they're the most useful. Yeah. So maybe that answers your question. Good question. All right. This next one is from P. Komarek, I guess, on a video called Understanding Room Modes, How Odd Room Dimensions Shape Your Sound. And he says, while watching, I wondered whether one could, in theory, create an angled wall, not perpendicular to the others, which created room modes across a specific frequency range to boost dips in the frequency response. That is, instead of absorbing energy, what if we try to redirect it to flatten the frequency response? And then I discarded the idea because I'm guessing it will destroy the phase response. I think there's a slight misunderstanding here in your question, yeah, because the room modes are what creates the peaks and dips in the first place. So you can't redirect the thing that is causing the problem in the first place. What you want to do is not have the cause for the peaks and dips, right? So that's why we tend to dampen room modes with our treatment. That's the idea, right? We want to reduce the ability of the room to go into resonance, yeah, which is what room modes are. Yeah, so unfortunately, you're a bit misled by your question thinking about this. You don't want any room modes, ideally, because they are what creates the peaks and dips. So you can't use them to counteract something they created in the first place, if that makes sense. Okay? Still interesting question, though. So this next one is on the video I did with John Darko, Speaker Spotlight. John Darko's take on speakers and acoustics, part 2. Krell666 asks, if the top end of mastering engineers are using uber high-priced monitor systems with incredible detail, rubber band analogy, then why are so many masters so terrible? John Darko alluded to this with ridiculous dynamic compression on almost all modern remasters. Is it a case of you can have the expensive tools but still have poor taste? Very much so. You got to remember that mastering, in many cases, just like the rest of the music creation process, is a creative process. Somebody there is making creative decisions. And the speakers are just a tool that you use to make your decisions. Yeah, but you are still the one making the decisions. The speakers aren't making those decisions for you. So you might have poor taste. You might have clients that want, if we're talking about ridiculous dynamic compression, that might want that. You might be dealing with a mix that comes already overcompressed, and for reasons you don't have the ability to go back and change that. You might just be very bad at your job. Yeah, let's face it. Yeah, you're not gonna churn out perfect masters every time. Yeah, hopefully the really high-end, top-end people do, but I mixed professionally for 10 years, and I would say every 10th mix, I went down a path where after 2-3 kind of internal revisions, so before I presented this to my customers, I realized this isn't working at all, and I needed to start from scratch. Yeah, so I even as a seasoned professional, you sometimes just screw it up. Yeah, because it's art. Yeah, so this isn't to blame on the speakers. The speakers are just a tool. They don't do anything by themselves. The person using that tool is the one making the decisions. So if a master is terrible, it is definitely down to the humans and not the technology. Yeah, in most cases. All right, unless obviously they have a very bad setup for whatever reason, but then why the heck are they mastering in the first place? Anyway, good question. Moving on. This next one is by Adonalmao on a video called Bass Traps, Pressure versus Velocity. Which one should you guess? And he says, PSI AVAA solve many issues associated with pressure traps. My room transformed after adding 5. Yeah, good point. The fact that I'm wearing this t-shirt should say something. I am in the process of testing the PSIs. More on that in a future video. A couple of notes on this comment. Yes, they solve many issues in the very low end. They do work, as far as I can tell, under specific circumstances, which I will get to in a later video. Just as a kind of quick comment, yes, your room transformed after adding 5. These cost, what is it, 4,000 USD a pop? right? So we're talking 20,000 US dollars for 5 of these units, yeah? Just as a side note. Moving on. This one is by EZST Productions on a video called Computer Screens. What's the right size for my studio? And he says, so the screen in the middle of your speaker can't affect your depth perception. There has to be some reflection that bounce off the edge of the speaker that hit the monitor and then your ears, no? So in many cases, in many ways, this video was a question of priorities, yeah? The question is how much, in my opinion, how much does the screen between your monitors affect what you're hearing? There are obviously circumstances, scenarios where some energy somehow gets affected by the screen between your monitors. That said, you say that some reflection bounces off the edge of the speaker, and somehow that doesn't really make sense to me, because the end of the speaker obviously creates the energy. Yes, we have edge diffraction effects. So some, and obviously speakers, depending on the frequency, do play energy into the direction, in the direction of the monitor between the speakers. But does some energy played by the speaker reflect off the edge? This is a very tangled up question, yeah? And then just think about the geometry of the speaker if the monitor is between your speakers, right? Remember that reflections, thinking about reflections is a game of geometry. It's like playing pool, like billiards. So somehow that energy that hits the surface needs to reflect back to your listening position in order to have an effect at your listening position. So and then the whole principle of inbound angle versus outbound angle counts, right? So the energy will reflect off of that surface at the angle that it hits the surface. And when you're thinking about the geometry of where the monitor, the screen sits between your speakers, it's kind of difficult, yeah? So yes, and I've gotten a lot of feedback on this video, by the way. There is some effect that you can probably hear when you do screen, no screen, depending on the size of your screen, where exactly you place it, the type of speaker, all that. But in terms of priorities, how high is that in the grand scheme of all the other things that you need to look at when you're setting up a monitoring system in a room that tells you what you need to know that you can work on reliably? Yeah, and in that context, the placement of the screen and the computer size, the screen size, is not that important if you follow some very basic guidelines. Yeah, but still, good question. This next one is by Pulio Inside on a video called Small Room Acoustics, 3 acoustics effects you will never get rid of. And he says, hi Jesko, thanks for the video. I find your channel very useful for people like me who are getting started with room acoustics. Thank you. I asked 2 questions. Maybe they can give you an idea for future videos. Do you think that tilting monitors upwards can help acoustics by changing the angle of the reflections? In case the computer screen is between monitors, is it playing a role in the reflections pattern? So I just answered the second part of this question, but the first question, do you think tilting monitors upwards can help acoustics by changing the angle of the reflections? In some cases, yes, but this isn't something where I can definitively say yes or no, because there are too many variables that it depends on. Most importantly, the dispersion pattern of your speaker, so aka which speaker you're using, and the desk, and well, assuming that you're talking about the desk. I'm just realizing that you didn't actually mention the desk, but I think that's what you're talking about. Yeah, so the size of the desk, the position of the desk relative to the speakers, all those play a role in defining, dictating how much energy is reflected off of the desk and back to the ears. Yeah, and so will tilting your monitors up help? It might, but it might not. And in my opinion, this is a matter of priorities. I think it is better to just mount your speakers at ear height. So with the acoustic center of your speakers at ear height, I just usually use the tweeters as a reference point because it's good enough, and just deal and just live with the desk reflection. Yeah, it's something that appears in most cases, but it's one of the many things that you just can't really get rid of properly unless you have a big enough room where you can place the speakers in a way that the energy doesn't get reflected back to your to your ears. Yeah, and that is a luxury that only studio control rooms that are large enough can have. And so I just wouldn't worry about it, because it's one of the many things that in many cases you just can't really do anything about, apart from maybe using some EQ at the end. But even in that, with that, I'm like, is it going to help you make your mixes translate better? Probably not. Yeah. So, yeah, I don't recommend doing this tilting thing with your speakers. If you want to, go for it, but I think it's just asking for more issues. It's just asking for, it's just making something more complicated that doesn't need to be. Moving on to Yoast3783 on a video called The Truth, getting your newly treated mixing studio to translate. So he says, does this make a lot of sense? Does anybody know if Jesko has a video on what could be some possible issues if you continuously feel like you've got too much 100 to 400 hertz in your mixes? I often feel like I've got more build up there, but I'm not sure if it actually might be a combination of the things he addressed here. Yeah, it sounds to me like it is. Yeah, if you continuously putting too much 100 to 400 hertz in your mixes, this is typically a problem that appears in mixes done by someone who doesn't have that much experience yet. Yeah, why? Because this is kind of the lower mid-range of music, upper bass, if you will, and a lot of instruments have energy down here, and it tends to a lot of superfluous energy in a lot of instruments tend to pile up in that range. Yeah, so my first instinct will be to say you need to learn more about proper arrangement, right? So this is picking the right instruments for your music and placing them in the right register. Yeah, this is a songwriting production arrangement problem, most likely. There is a chance that you will have you don't get enough energy from that particular frequency band in your particular room. That is possible, and so you might be compensating for that by putting in too much energy in that range. But my initial instinct is that you need to look at arrangement and how to properly place instruments, layers in your mixes. Yeah, because that's usually where issues like these come from. Yeah, good question though. And the final one, this one is by Dextrous7516 on a video called Subwoofers, How to Place Your Sub Correctly in a Home Studio. This is a video I did with Head Audio a while back. And he says, thanks for the detailed video. I have a different question for you. In your video, I see that you have exactly the same heater unit as what I have in mine. It is the one with holes in it. Now what happens is that it carries sound to the neighbors. Sometimes I can also hear neighbors from there if they are loud. A while ago, my neighbor told me that he could hear me talking calls if I'm loud, when I was actually very near that unit, similar to your setup. Now I want to do some audio production at home and also record some songs with me singing, but I'm just too afraid that it will disturb others. So my question is, what do you do to not let sound escape through it? In summer, I basically just cover the whole thing with some covers. I was also thinking to buy the soundproof curtains and wrap it for summer, but this is not a proper solution. Yeah, I mean, this is a soundproofing question, a noise transition issue. Yeah, this isn't room acoustics as such, not my speciality. So I can't really give you a definitive answer. But yeah, ultimately you need to stop sound from entering into that heating radiator unit. Yeah, because once it's in there, it will get transferred over to the other side. Yeah. And chances are high that the only way to do this properly is to replace the unit itself. You might want to look at a different YouTube channel. Let me just quickly look this up. So you might want to look at Soundproof Your Studio. He does some excellent videos. He's definitely got way more experience with soundproofing and noise than I do. Yeah, my specialty really is acoustic treatment, room acoustics. So yeah, definitely check that out. But as I said, chances are the only right way to do this is to replace the unit itself. All right, let's leave it at that. Thanks for everybody for commenting on my videos. I really do appreciate it. With that, I hope you learned something. Let's get back to learning to trust our ears and having fun making music in the studio. I'll see you in the next video.